What is clear is that the British people want their troops home. What is less certain is the view of the Afghan people. A recent poll conducted in Afghanistan by ARD, the BBC and ABC threw up some surprising results. 70% of those questioned said Afghanistan is going in the right direction, and 68% felt that they back the continued presence of NATO forces.
The difference with this deployment, as opposed to previous ones, whether it were the Soviets in the 1980s, whether it is the British in the 19th century, you're really looking at a involvement that's accepted by the broad majority of Afghans. There's an insurgency, but it's not a popular insurgency. It never has been. There are large segments of the population in the south that do support the Taliban, but the overall population does not. And even in the polling over the last few years, where the Afghans have blamed NATO forces for levels of violence and civilian casualties, they've never switched en masse to supporting the Taliban. And the recent polls conducted by the BBC and ARD show that 70% of the Afghans believe the future will be better, and a similar number, around 70%, blame the Taliban for the levels of violence. So they understand that the UN, that the NATO forces are there to help. They don't feel like they're necessarily being exploited or that they're trying to be forced down a certain path. And that's what the international community has to be careful to avoid. And that's why they want to get combat troops out of there as soon as possible. They don't want to be seen as sort of colonizing the country.
The results of this poll were seized on by some commentators who urged caution and warned perhaps the poll was not to be taken too seriously. After all, this same poll indicated President Hamid Karzai enjoyed widespread support, with 90% of those approached approving of the Karzai government. Since Karzai managed less than 50% of the votes in the last presidential elections, his newfound A-grade rating throws the rest of the poll findings into doubt.
It's a bit more complicated.
We're at the London conference on Afghanistan. No, not the one attended by Hamid Karzai, Gordon Brown, Hillary Clinton and other world figures, but this one organized by the Stop the War campaign. And we can assure you the message is an entirely different one. What's the message you're trying to bring home tonight to the audience?
Well, we've got a very clear message coming from the meeting here tonight. It's going to the international leaders tomorrow. We don't want any more troops sent to Afghanistan. On the contrary, we want all troops withdrawn from Afghanistan. That is the only way to get peace for that country and peace for that region.
How are you proposing we do that? We just leave?
Absolutely. We don't believe that these troops that are there now, the NATO troops, the US troops, the British troops, they cannot contribute to the peace and stability of that country. Afghanistan must forge its own future, its democratic future. Warmongers have no place in that process.
Founded in 2001 in response to the launch of the so-called War on Terror, the Stop the War Coalition has been at the forefront of opposition to Britain's wars around the world. Held the night before the London conference on Afghanistan, the Stop the War event was billed as a political alternative, with prominent speakers such as the MP George Galloway, Tony Benn, campaigners Kate Hudson and Lindsay German, and the Guardian writer Seamus Mill. Perhaps the British government should have sent an official to take some notes.
Well, I would like to begin by congratulating the Stop the War Coalition on organising this meeting and meetings that are going on all over the country all the time, because they do represent a majority of British opinion which was against the war in Iraq, is against the war in Afghanistan, and I want to suggest that we are a major educational force and should see our work in that way. If there are demonstrations, they get coverage, that discussion goes on about what we're doing. The meetings are educational in character, and we are a campaigning organisation. And we are campaigning against a war that has now lasted almost as long as two world wars put together, 1914 to 1918, 4 years, 1939 to 1945, 6 years, 10 years. Well, it'll be 10 years this coming September that the Afghan war will have begun.
And we were told it was all going to be over by Christmas. Women were throwing off their burqas and kites were flying in Afghanistan. And those of us who said that it would lead to a long-term occupation were denounced by the government as scaremongers. 8 years on, we've been proved painfully right, and this war is now being escalated with tens of thousands of new troops in a quagmire that I would say threatens us all in this part of the world as well as in that region itself.
It has been announced in the last couple of days that this society is getting more and more unequal, that the poor are poorer and the rich are richer. And there are also talks about big cuts coming in hospitals and schools and closing down whole accident emergency and doing all this kind of thing and shutting down whole universities. What kind of a society are we that never questions the need to go to war, that never questions the cost of war, that never questions all of these things, but never has the money to look after the poorest children in this society?
The foreign occupation of Afghanistan is doomed. It's going to be defeated sooner or later. Better that it's sooner. We can't afford it. And the life's blood of our own soldiers, never mind the Afghan people, is too valuable for us to allow uncontested their intention to stay.
Anyway, that's my argument, comrades, and I hope that in discussing you'll take it up and improve it and develop it, because there is an audience waiting to hear exactly what we are saying tonight. Thank you.
So when you get an opportunity to maybe have a few snatch words with some of those leaders coming into the conference tomorrow, what are you going to be saying to them very quickly?
Well, I think we have to say to them they have to face reality. They are losing the war in Afghanistan. It's an unjustified war in Afghanistan, and they have to get their troops out. And until they do that, this vicious circle of so-called failed states, of increasing terrorism, will just be more and more a fact of life for people in countries like Britain.
The next day, world leaders and foreign ministers from over 70 countries gathered in London to discuss the future of Afghanistan at the London conference. 9 years after invading Afghanistan, NATO leaders were in search of a new strategy for the country. Some of the strategies unveiled included efforts to curb Afghanistan corruption. There were also pledges made to boost the number of Afghan army and police numbers. Afghan forces will number 300,000 by the end of 2010, with the hope that they would have control of most of the country's security in the next 3 to 5 years.
The intention is for some provinces to transition by late 2010, early 2011, on the road to meeting President Karzai's commitment that half of Afghanistan's provinces would have Afghan security leadership within 3 years, and the whole of Afghanistan be within Afghan security leadership within 5.
Alongside aid and reconstruction packages, it was announced that more NATO troops would be sent to Afghanistan, with Britain already pledging 500 troops on the proviso that Afghanistan's government cleans up its act. Is this little more than a symbolic gesture to show ongoing support for the war effort? Britain's pledged an additional 500 troops. Is this not just a symbolic move?
It's very unlikely that those kind of numbers are going to tip the battle, but I think tip the balance. But I think it's as much as anything about providing as many troops as we can, and I think that's the symbolic message in providing extra troops. Yeah.
Even before the conference, there had been criticism that the London summit would be a glorified press opportunity, with key decisions already made. Another major point of contention for some campaigners was the fact that a withdrawal of foreign troops, an issue they consider crucial to the country's future, was not even on the agenda. Despite the wranglings about what the London conference on Afghanistan did achieve, there was still some time for the most controversial announcement of the summit. A national reconciliation strategy was unveiled, which would mean so-called moderate Taliban would be reincorporated into Afghan society.